Hello, this is Morale Bernard with the continuation of the story All in the Mind. Oh, the mind is very powerful. The power of the mind. Last words were he decided that the unit resembling a flashlight could be mounted in a concealed spot under his eye so that it could be fired at whatever he might be looking at. And can I just remind listeners, please subscribe. Please subscribe, listener. Please subscribe to the channel if you've not already done so. And please share. Yeah, please share. Thank you very much. Anyway, let me get on with it. Now that he had a means of defending himself, Mel felt more at ease but at a loss for his next step. Merely eliminating both Jenkins and Neil would gain his revenge, but what then? He could always notify the authorities, but mentally flinched at exposing himself to the world as a freak and being at the mercy of the morbid curiosity of millions. He had already begun to lay his plans before disaster struck. Neil came in early one morning and had Mel begin working on a problem concerning a new type of steel that would combine structural strength with the lightweight qualities of aluminium. Mel energized his calculators that were electrically, practically part of the brain. He briefly wondered why Neil appeared so restless, wandering around the room with his hands behind his back, studying everything. Then the problem became so intriguing that he completely forgot that anyone else was in the room. His first inkling that anything was wrong was when Neil straightened up from the cart with a twisted smile on his face and exclaimed, "Ha!" Mel's first startled conjecture was that the other had discovered the special weapon. He tried to rotate the lens so that the weapon would point at Neil, but could see, by other stationary lenses in the room, that the one on the cart remained motionless. The same was true of the mechanical arm. In fact, the entire cart was dead. "I pulled the main power fuse," said Neil, a slight smile on his face. "I suppose you thought you were getting away with it completely." Not positive as to how much his partner knew, Mel decided on silence as his defense. The smile disappeared from the other's face, and he continued slowly. "Something must be wrong with your reasoning. I knew something was up when the power company's statement showed an unusually high increase in power consumption. From there on, it was easy to read the meters at night myself. And then the next morning, what were you up to anyway?" Mel still maintained his silence. "Okay, if that's the way you want it," said Neil more harshly. He walked to the end of the tank, and Mel felt his brain telegraphing warnings to sever nerve connections not yet again in use. Neil reached out to a valve Mel recognized as controlling the minute amount of chemical that served to nourish the cells in his brain. Relays were connected to it that also regulated the injection of oxygen proportionately into the fluid. He turned it slightly, then began watching the oscilloscope closely. In a matter of seconds, Mel felt his usually sharp senses begin to dull. The oscilloscope blurred until, by great effort, he brought it into focus again. He saw that the height of the wavy line denoting the strength of his brain's output was abnormally low. "Feeling all right?" asked Neil in mock anxiety. He turned the valve back to its correct setting, and almost instantly Mel felt better. "That's just a sample of what can happen if you force me to it," warned the other. "A little more of a turn, and that super brain of yours will be garbage. Only I wouldn't do that, of course. There are a few more experiments I want to make before your brain dies." Knowing the vicious nature of his partner, Mel decided to talk before the other goaded himself into some unplanned action. "Don't forget the fable about the goose that laid the golden eggs," his voice rolled out. "There's still a lot I could do for you, you know. Or not do." He saw with relief that the anger receded from the other's face to be replaced by a look of cunning. "I almost forgot," said Neil. "I have another surprise for you." He went to a circuit near the master calculator that he himself had installed only several days ago. As the master components were open, a rheostat appearing to be the primary control. Mel had decided at the time it had to do with voltage regulation of the calculator, since there had been trouble with it. Neil placed his hand on it, then turned his head in the general direction of the tank and said, "Just in case you get ideas of not cooperating, I can use this for persuasion." He cracked the veneer just a trifle. An agony knifed through Mel's brain. It receded, leaving a slight ache. "Not much voltage," Neil was saying with satisfaction, "but judging from the way your brain wave jumped, I don't imagine it felt very good, did it?" "You win," said Mel's only comment, not wanting another jolt. Never before had he felt so helpless and completely at the mercy of another. He realized more and more that he had less defense than a newborn baby, which could at least kick and wave its hands. He could do nothing except try to retain his sanity and wait for his day to come. "Good," approved his partner, his manner indicating that it was the most natural thing in the world that Mel should give in. "Just in case you forget, I think I'll keep the cart disconnected so that you can't do anything to harm yourself at night." His manner abruptly turned businesslike. "Now then, that paint formula story you got around, and we've got a lot of business to handle. Most of it's routine for you, but we'll drag it out and sock them plenty. A couple of items we'll copy after you've solved them and say it couldn't be done." Mel missed the cart more than he thought he would. It was much like the time when, as a boy, he'd broken a leg and had to stay in bed for several weeks. He was forced to turn in on himself. The real turn in the development of his mind and above the level he had thought possible came about as an accident one day. Resting, with nothing to do, he had the full room in vision with the stationary lenses. A flicker of motion caught his attention, and careful waiting disclosed it to be a small mouse that had somehow gained access to the laboratory and then into his room. Welcoming any change in his routine, he watched as the small creature scurried around the room looking for something to eat. Several times, Mel amused himself by causing his voice box to rumble, making the rodent scurry around madly for a hiding place until the imagined danger had passed. Eventually, it became used to the noise, and not even talking affected it. It disappeared from sight for several minutes, and Mel had just begun to wonder if it had a nest in the equipment when it reappeared on top of the calculator, near the electrical prod that Neil had used on his brain. Remembering the searing jolt it had given him, Mel watched anxiously as the mouse pushed an inquisitive nose into the still exposed components. He became more concerned as the animal became more intrigued. Not only was there danger that the mouse would push down on a delicate relay and close it, but he could conceivably short out the main power supply. The result wasn't pleasant to contemplate. If it didn't permanently damage some of his brain cells, the pain might drive him into insanity. He tried shouting, but the mouse paid no attention to him. He called for first Jenkins and then Neil until he remembered that his partner had said they were going in after some special equipment. While he watched helplessly, the mouse stretched out and touched a relay point. Instantly pain knifed through his brain, and he became aware of a roaring sound that he realized was his voice blaring out. The extra loud and continued blast of sound had caused the mouse to withdraw nervously from the relay. Something about it had made him determined, however, and as Mel was barely recovering from the first jolt, the mouse moved back. Mel wished desperately that the cart had been left in operation so that he might at least use the sound of emotion or the mechanical arm to frighten his tiny tormentor from the vicinity of the relay. He watched intently as the mouse came closer to the points, oblivious to everything else in the room. As it almost touched the points, a violent surge of hate coursed through his brain cells, and he was surprised to see the mouse flung violently back down to the floor. It lay there, motionless, and he finally realized, with thankfulness, that it was dead. As the pain from the jolt subsided to the point where he could barely feel it, he began to wonder what had happened. The amount of voltage necessary to hurt him was so small that nothing beyond a direct short across the primary power would have affected the mouse. He began to analyze everything, preceding the point where the mouse had been flung from the top of the calculator. A check and recheck brought the same answer, one that he had at first refused to believe. His thoughts had been responsible. Further contemplation convinced him that while his thoughts had undoubtedly been responsible, the mental power itself had not been enough as pure brute force to accomplish the task, but must have struck at the rodent's brain instead. That would have been enough to convulse the animal's muscles and make it look at first as if some outside force had hurled it to the floor. The stolid Jenkins was somewhat perturbed when he found the dead mouse. But how could it get in here? He demanded quarrelsomely. Then, as if in sudden thought, and what could have killed it? Mel suddenly decided that it might be better if the other was set at ease, since even Jenkins could dissect it if he became curious enough and might find enough to make Neil suspicious. "I saw it yesterday," he said. "I didn't say anything since it was interesting and was company for me. I noticed that it was moving more slowly today and seemed to be weaker. It must have starved to death. Nothing to eat in here, and he couldn't get out." "Yeah," agreed the other, picking it up and throwing it into a waste paper basket. The explanation had evidently satisfied him, since he went about his routine task. After the excitement of his discovery had worn off, Mel began to cautiously test its potential. He carefully directed his thoughts at Jenkins and caused an instant reaction. For a brief moment, he felt a resilient pressure as if something were pressing against his own brain. He instinctively pushed back harder and heard Jenkins yell as the opposing pressure collapsed. The assistant was leaning against the work table, a dazed look on his face. "What happened?" Mel asked. "I don't know," said the other, pressing a hand to the side of his head. "It felt as if something had hit me in the head. Now it aches a little. Guess I'll have to do something about this cold." He left, still holding a hand to his head. It was obvious that his newly discovered power could be dangerous, so Mel proceeded with his experimenting more slowly. Jenkins was still his only guinea pig, and he learned to gauge just when the assistant's resistance was about to collapse, and reduce the intensity of his own probing accordingly. He was disappointed to discover that either it was impossible to read another's mind, or that he hadn't discovered the method. However, he could roughly direct the other's actions. Jenkins had been becoming increasingly nervous, so Mel became even more subtle in his experimenting. He'd wait until the assistant was idle, and then either make him cross his legs or put one or the other of his hands up to scratch his head. He finally became so smooth and accurate in his control that it lost most of its interest as a means of recreation. He began to extend his range. Wood and concrete offered no impedance at all. Metal, with the exception of aluminium, cut the intensity roughly about half. Jenkins was in Mel's room when he first probed Neil's brain. His partner's mental resistance was much higher, and he pressed slowly but methodically so that the breakthrough would be controlled. To his surprise, he found that Neil's brain was much easier to control than that of Jenkins had been. It was about this time that he found he was beginning to master the sharing of his host's eyesight. While he might not be able to read another's mind, it would be a big help to know what someone else was doing or what he was looking at. He tried searching outside the building, but found nothing, other than an occasional small spot of resistance that would probably indicate a small animal. This wasn't surprising, since the lab was hidden in caves in a secluded canyon that had no attraction to the casual wanderer. His next concentration was on the animals he encountered ever so often. His first few attempts resulted in sudden and complete collapse of resistance, and he sadly concluded that his control had been too powerful and resulted in their death. He tried more carefully and was overjoyed when he established contact with their visual senses. The sensation was almost as overpowering as if he had suddenly gained eyesight of his own. For the first time in months, he revelled in seeing the country around the outside of the lab, and never before had he thought it was so beautiful. Once, while in control of a rabbit's mind, he saw an eagle flying overhead. He quickly transferred, and before the bird flew far enough away to make control impossible, he enjoyed the far-reaching vision of the bird's eyes as it swept on towards some hidden nest. He could even see the city in the distance. Several times he neglected to notice Neil's entrance into the room. So absorbed did he become in his newly discovered, if second-hand, freedom. "What happened to you anyway?" demanded his erstwhile partner one day after he had to repeat a question. "Half of the time lately you're lost in a world of your own. What you up to anyway?" "Nothing," replied Mel, suddenly alert to any new danger, although confident he could take care of himself now. "I was just going over some new equations I've been formulating as a hobby. Now that you've taken away my cart, there isn't much to keep me occupied, you know. You don't begin to bring enough problems. What's wrong?" Mel wished that he could read the other's mind, since Neil began to act evasive. He laughed with a false heartiness. "Wrong. Why, he corrected, already made a fortune on a couple of our own patterns as well as commissions from project solutions. Someone might get suspicious if we did too well or too much. This made sense, but Mel couldn't resist digging. You mean that your past record of success as measured against your supposed one now might make the police ask questions? He asked. The other remained silent to be pressed the attack. Or are they already wondering why I haven't been seen for so long? There were a few questions at first, admitted the other, but I think I've satisfied them all. However, I've been thinking that it might be a good idea to move you somewhere else. But hardly anyone knows the lab exists, protested Mel. The power company does, even if the meters are way down the road. We should have planned on our own generators from the first. Then there's the deed recorder. This land is in both of our own names, you know. It'd still be a tremendous project, pointed out Mel. You couldn't begin to keep the new location secret because you'd need help in moving me. One little slip, and it'd be all over. There was an upward curl to the other's lips that Mel didn't like. Oh, we'd have to be careful, he admitted. Luckily, the time delay wouldn't hurt any. There's so much money rolling in. He hesitated for a moment, as if in thought, then concluded, in fact, there's no project on now unless you have a private one of your own. It might be a good idea to plan on the move right away. Join me for the next video of Power of the Mind, All in the Mind. Join me for the next video of All in the Mind. Join me then, or I'll say, join me in the next video. Okay, bye-bye for now. Bye.